Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq, coming to you live from Toronto at Consensus2025 by CoinDesk. Joining me for this segment, we have Ari Redbord. He's VP and Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. We're going to discuss crypto regulatory framework and enforcement. Ari, it's great to see you again. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, Jill, thank you so much for having me.
All right.
This is awesome. Like, there's so much energy and there's so many people here. It's really exciting.
Really, speaking of energy,
yes.
We're going to go a little bit off the beaten path here. Tell me about the running club.
Oh, amazing.
Yes.
All right. So the TRM Run Club is an official event of Consensus. This is the second year they've made it that. We had about 65 runners show up in Austin last year, and it's fun. It's something I do when I travel, and it's now turned into this really cool thing where we've done it for Paris Blockchain Week and ACAMS and really like run clubs all over the world. So it's cool. Think about like the best networking that you've ever done and like feeling really good about it at crypto conferences. So it's a really cool event, and excited to run along the lakeshore tomorrow in Toronto.
Yeah, definitely different experience running in 100-degree heat in Austin.
Oh, this is perfect for it.
This is very good running weather. Let's get back to the matter at hand here, though. What's most top of mind when it comes to policy, when it comes to regulation in the crypto space right now?
No, absolutely. And look, I think what we've now see in the U.S. for the first time is every branch of the U.S. government engaged in a meaningful way. So sort of starting with the executive branch, we've really seen the SEC and the CFTC and the Department of Justice move away from enforcing against lawful crypto businesses. Think, Coinbase and Ripple and a lot of the lawsuits that were going on before. And my hope is, though, that there'll be a renewed focus or even stronger focus on actual illicit actors. Think ransomware, darknet markets, hacks, right? We had this huge Bybit hack. So my hope is that we'll move away from enforcing against lawful crypto businesses, but continue or maybe even increase our focus on going after illicit actors who are a real threat to the ecosystem.
Which is so interesting because when you think about the structure and hopefully, a federal regulatory framework around digital assets, it does include AI. It does include cybersecurity. So it makes you wonder, will that framework perhaps move along and the full elements of that into other areas of policy that needs to be formulated? A little bit off the beaten path here, but...
No, I love it. And look,
right?
I mean, we have never seen technology move faster than it's moving right now, whether we're talking about blockchain, whether we're talking about AI. And at TRM, what we're thinking about when it comes to AI is, A, how can we leverage it? Right? We're auto tracing in our tool. We're identifying patterns and networks in ways that you really never could even a few years ago. But we're also really focused on how are bad actors supercharging criminal activity using AI. And we're really in a world where we're going to be using AI. Law enforcement is going to be using AI to combat cyber criminals who are using it at scale. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this sort of technology battle ultimately plays out. I believe we're building tools that will be able to mitigate a lot of the risks, certainly to the crypto ecosystem today.
You definitely see the synergies with the frameworks there because a lot of the terminology that we discuss in the cybersecurity landscape, you're hearing it come up more now. And typically it was more about the trading and the infrastructure and the engineering and ethos behind DeFi and digital assets. Now we're starting to have those conversations thinking about cybersecurity by design within the platforms.
Well, one thing I thought was really smart is when the White House created the sort of czar, David Sachs, it wasn't just crypto, it wasn't just AI, it was both.
Yeah.
And what it really allows us to do is focus on emerging technology, mostly for good. But at TRM, I'm always thinking about how do we stop illicit actors from taking advantage of this technology. But look, the executive branch is not the only place. I think right now, top of mind for everyone, I kind of couldn't believe I left Washington this week, where stablecoin legislation is, top of mind for everybody. Ultimately, the law lost a procedural vote last week, that really is not dispositive. That doesn't mean this is over. It just means that it's a little bit back to work, hopefully to provide enough to create consensus and move this bill forward, which is really, I think, the hope of the industry and certainly my hope, because I think we need really strong, sound legislation, stable coins, and eventually market structure, but one at a time. And I think right now it's stable coins.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest threat to crypto right now?
Yeah. Look, I think that when we live in a world where North Korea can steal 1.5 billion from a crypto exchange in one day and use those funds for weapons proliferation and other types of destabilizing activity, I think that is a huge threat. And it's not just a national security threat. People aren't going to want to put their funds on platforms if they're afraid of losing them. So I think that's an absolutely huge piece of this. I think the other piece, which is very different, and that is we need regulatory clarity. We need rules of the road for businesses to build. And it's a very different view. But like in order for the ecosystem to grow, when we talk to our clients at TRM, whether they're banks, whether they're crypto businesses, they're all looking for, hey, having rules is just as important. Knowing what the speed limit is so we can drive in the first place is just as important. And we have that today in places like Dubai and Singapore and Japan. We have it in Canada, whether people like it or not, right? The provincial securities regulators right here in Toronto, right? The Ontario securities regulator is the regulator for the space. They know what the rules are, and we see builders building. So I think what we need in the US is rules of the road. I think we're moving in that direction, and we'll ultimately see how this plays out. I think sooner rather than later, at least for stablecoins.
I would agree with you. I think the catalyst is not necessarily the products that are coming on board, but if you get that regulatory framework, that's the catalyst. That's when you start to see scale. That's when things take off on a massive scale.
Absolutely. I was in New York about 2 weeks ago, meeting what I would say with like most major banks, many of whom are using TRM today to figure out how to safely engage with digital assets from a market abuse, from an illicit finance perspective. And they're all sort of still in that we're ready to go, whether it's custody, whether it's offering digital assets, whether it's issuing a stablecoin. But there's still a little bit of that reluctance because they don't know what the regulatory rules of the road are today. And even though our regulatory framework is more permissive than it was a few months ago in the prior administration, you still don't have legislation, right? Like you still don't have a bill to point to and say, hey, no, this is actually what market structure looks like in the US today. And I think they're going to really need that. I mean, these are some of the most conservative institutions in the world. They're going to need that to get in. I think that's going to be really important for growing the ecosystem.
I mean, in fairness, think about all the jurisdictions under which they have to operate, all the different agencies and regulators that they need to respond to. So if you are unsure how to operate and you kind of wing it and then the structure completely changes on you, that's a massive reshift of thinking and resources.
Totally. And it's not just like banks, at least in large part, have one jurisdiction or at least, one country.
Right.
Crypto is so global, right? You have these huge exchanges which operate essentially everywhere. And they're getting licenses in Dubai and Singapore and, New York. DFS is regulating a lot of the space, but it's really complicated. And ultimately, they're going to need to sort of have at least some consistent standards across jurisdictions to really help these businesses operate. First things first, let's get this right in the US. I think we're closer than we've ever been, but there's some days where it feels like we're still, slowly moving forward.
Well, I don't know if it's devil's advocate, if that's the right way to describe it. You have the EU legislation in place. It tends to be the most strict around the world. So why not operate under those types of confines that you can operate there? And it kind of is applicable around the world. Is there a way that we can just adopt that? I mean, I understand the U.S. Regulatory system and how we develop legislation is a completely different animal, but can we take elements from that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And my view is like you can certainly take elements from this. Peter Kirsten, who's one of the fathers of MiCA, the marketing crypto, that's a regulation talks about all the time that U.S. policymakers have come and talked to him and other policymakers in Europe. I think the challenge is it's just such a different regulatory regime, right? They have 37 member states who are all sort of at different stages of things. They don't have the issues of sort of like national regulators, one who regulates just securities, one who regulates commodities, a Fed, the U.S. Treasury Department. Like we have such a disparate set of financial regulators in the U.S. that like they're already off and running to how do we regulate the space. We haven't even gotten to who's going to regulate the space, right? We're still in this battle between the SEC and the CFTC. Less a battle than it was, 6 months ago. I think now they're really working closely together, which is very cool to see. But I think it's just a very different framework. Well, will we have consistency? Certainly. If you're talking about stable coins, there'll be reserve requirements and there'll be accounting standards. And there'll be like basically safety and security type of layering in there. And there will be a lot of similarities, but inevitably just the differences between, the US market and these 37 member states trying to figure it out in the EU, you're going to have significant differences.
Yes. Well, let's end on a positive note. What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I'd say like a lot of the things we talked about today are like the things I'm most excited about. I think a combination of we are going to get regulation and legislation. Look, if there's no legislation passed today, we have a really thoughtful SEC that's engaging with the industry. TRM met with the crypto task force a few weeks ago, and they were asking questions like, what would be your wish list for like a sound regulatory? I mean, that is an absolute sea change. So, and they're holding these roundtables. Treasury's hosting a series of roundtables that we're participating in this week. So I think there's like a lot of real engagement going on, and I think that's really exciting. The other piece is the markets. Like, our banks are really trying to figure this out. Every week there's some kind of announcement from a traditional financial institution that, Bank of America announced a stablecoin, a few weeks ago. Yesterday, it's not exactly banks, but Robinhood, which I would call like a mix of TradFi and crypto, announced a new presence in Canada with a acquisition of WonderFi, which their booth is like right over there. Yeah, but we're seeing this happen in real time, and I think it's fun. So I think you have this combination of sort of like a better, if not permissive, regulatory framework, and that's allowing businesses to really build here. And I think it's an incredibly exciting moment for the space. And I think that like people are celebrating that here at Consensus this week.
Right. Appreciate the insight as always, Ari. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thanks, Jill.
And thanks for joining me from Consensus. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.